All right, thanks so much, Naomi. Good. It's been a long day, and in fact, two long days, and it's been intense, and I guess at least a few of you might be a little tired. So I'm glad to let you know I'm going to keep all of you awake by covering something fascinating that I discovered, I think. So some of you have already, in the lectures, the keynotes, and some of the other talks, have already played with this concept of resilience and kind of shown where it can go wrong and how it can be extended and the like. And I'm going to join that venerable tradition by showing that there is a dimension to resilience that is sometimes neglected, or almost always, I would say, and that is epistemic resilience. So resilience to evidence. And I'm going to explain that in a minute, what I mean by that, how it works in extreme beliefs, how it works in faith, and what this picture, you might have a guess though, what this picture of the Capitol, the seat of American democracy, has to do with that. It's going to get a little complicated later on, I'm afraid, so let me start real easy. Let me give some examples of what I consider to be extreme beliefs. Here are a couple. The only way to properly read the Bible is to read it literally, historically, cover to cover. Trump is fighting a cabal of satanistic, child-abusing pedophiles. That is the Democratic elite. Women should receive only that education which is necessary for being a mother and running the household. It is legitimate to exclude homosexuals from the community if they act on their sexual inclinations, or maybe even if they merely have them. And people of color are intellectually and culturally inferior to whites. And you may ask the question, what exactly makes these beliefs extreme? And you will find different answers in the literature. So some people say what makes them extreme is that they're a minority position, that they are positionally extreme, so to the far left for you or to the far right. Maybe the way they are held with complete certainty, for instance, maybe a particular mindset, a paranoid mindset, a dogmatic mindset, and so on. And I'm unhappy with all of those, to be honest. And we can cover them in the Q&A if you like. But here I'm just going to say that I suggest a slightly different approach, which is that these beliefs that I just mentioned and other extreme beliefs are individually characteristic and jointly constitutive of particular movements that fall within the following 5 phenomena, and you've seen them before. Extremism, fanaticism, terrorism, fundamentalism, and radical conspiracy theorizing. So the beliefs I just mentioned are elements in belief sets that as a whole are constitutive of various extremist movements or fanaticism movement. So the Art-Gemeinschaft movement in Germany, the right-wing organization, has a particular ideological belief set, and it comes with beliefs about whites, for instance, and culture, Western culture, and so on. So very roughly, there's of course, decades-old debate about this, but very roughly, extremism I take to be the ideological belief that one's own group can be successful and flourish only if it lives in adversity with another group or several groups. Fanaticism being the idea that, or fanaticism is the wholehearted, total devotion to a particular value that one considers sacred at the cost of other values. Terrorism, the use or threat of violence in order to reach political, ideological, religious purposes. Fundamentalism, contested notion, ask Nora, a modern response to modernity. So it responds to liberal ethics, it responds to modern scientific developments like evolutionary theory and Big Bang cosmology, but it is modern itself, for instance, by formulating certainties that are not to be questioned, and it often comes with cosmic dualism. Radical conspiracy theorizing, the idea that the big story to be told is one in terms of conspiracy of 2 or more persons who seek the harm, or at least not the flourishing, of a large group of people, including us. So that's a very rough sketch. So these are distinct, they're conceptually distinct, and of course they overlap, and maybe they increasingly overlap empirically, but we should conceptually keep them apart. So overlapping circles, and we try to spell this out in a bit more detail in one of the volumes, the second volume that I'm editing with John, and in which I've written a piece with J.M. Berger, Ruth Tietjen, and John himself on how to do this. Right, and so that means it goes from the far left, RAF, violent environmentalists, to the far right, neo-Nazism or Hindu ethno-nationalism, QAnon conspiracy theorizing, white Christian nationalism, and stuff in between. Salafi jihadism being left in some ways when it comes to migration, for instance, but being right-wing in other regards, for instance, when it comes to gender. Okay. Now, both in the public discourse and in the academic literature, there's this idea that extreme beliefs, and maybe particularly fundamentalist beliefs and conspiracy beliefs, come with resilience to evidence. And that is, of course, not resilience in the sense of the ability to resist and challenge the social legitimation of violent extremist propaganda, but it is resilience in this broader sense that we've talked about, namely a way of seeking to cope and thrive under adversity, adverse conditions, right? And how this is cashed out depends a little bit on the author in question. But the idea is, for instance, there is evidence out there, but these extreme beliefs don't change because one resists the evidence. One avoids it, or one reinterprets it, one discards it. There are various ways. All right. And of course, such resilience, such epistemic resilience, neglecting evidence, pushing back against evidence, is often usually thought to be something bad. So epistemically bad. So that word is derived from the Greek episteme, knowledge or understanding. So it stands in the way of acquiring knowledge and understanding. But also morally bad, because if you act on these extreme beliefs, it will harm, for instance, minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and the like. Right? Such epistemic resilience is thus epistemically and morally bad. Okay. So far, so good. But then we've got this other attitude that we also encounter. It's the attitude of faith. And faith is also widely thought to come with a certain resilience to evidence, both in the public discourse, but also in the academic debate. And let me be clear at the outset that when I speak about faith, I mean, of course, religious faith, faith in God, faith in, the Bible, the Quran, the church, Revelation, or the Ummah, the worldwide community of Muslims, but equally, and for my talk, even more importantly, secular faith. That is faith in democracy, faith in humanity, faith in the rule of law, and the like. And I think faith in democracy was even on one of your slides, John, earlier on. And finally, there's such a thing as mundane faith, such things as faith in your spouse, faith in science, maybe the Biden administration, your university board, maybe a bit rare. And since this is being recorded, let me be clear, I have complete faith in my university board. That is mundane faith. So there is religious faith, secular faith, and mundane faith. And it is thought to come with a certain resilience to evidence. So when there's evidence to the contrary, you don't give up your faith in democracy or your faith in your spouse. It can handle a bit of counter-evidence. But we just said that this resilience, epistemic resilience in extreme beliefs, is thought to be something problematic, something deficient. But faith is often thought of as a virtue. So remember, we've got Aristotle with the 4 virtues, the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. And then, of course, the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, 1 Corinthians 13, 7 virtues. But how could it be that faith is a virtue and yet comes with something epistemically or morally deficient? Right, so we've got extreme beliefs with epistemic resilience, faith with epistemic resilience. The one thing is a bad thing, the other thing is a good thing. That's the puzzle I want to address in my presentation. How should we make sense of this? And I think this will matter, and I will explain it in a bit more detail, because these interact with one another. For instance, faith in democracy and the extreme beliefs of right-wing or anti-institutional extremists, for instance. And I think what is new about this, or relatively new maybe, is that it focuses on the resilience of extremists, as, for instance, Michelle has been doing, and John as well, not so much the non-extremists. It pays attention to epistemic resilience rather than social-cultural resilience, for instance. And it looks at anti-social resilience among extremists and pro-social resilience, for instance, our faith in democracy, and how they relate to one another and interact with one another. So 4 questions. What is this epistemic resilience in extreme beliefs? What is it in faith? How do the two relate? And what light does that shed on our understanding of extremism and resilience? And I'm going to use a bit of philosophy and a little bit of theology to answer those questions. That's the plan for my talk. And it's work in progress, so these are just some wild ideas, and feel free to try to take them down. All right, so epistemic resilience in extreme beliefs. So the idea is not merely that many extreme beliefs, not all of them, but many of them are false or lack justification or are instances of ignorance rather than knowledge or are irrational. It goes a step further. They're resilient to evidence. And I would like to give a few examples from the literature, because I think you find this idea about extreme beliefs in historical, empirical, even philosophical literature. Right? Also epistemic resilience. Here's one example. Finlay Malcolm, an associate member in the team, he says, fundamentalists habitually close themselves off to counter-evidence and engage in belief-reinforcing practices, and in doing so, fail to explore alternative intellectual options. And here's Michel on Thursday. Extremist systems demonstrate many of these adaptive capabilities, but they also demonstrate rigidity, closed rather than open orientations, and often little or no diversity or redundancy. So the notion of epistemic resilience is not expressis verbis in there, but I think suggested by a phrase like closed rather than open orientations. And things are even more explicit in the literature on conspiracy theorizing. So in the work of Giulia Napolitano, you find this idea, this concept of evidential self-insulation. So there it's not merely that you're resistant to evidence, but these conspiracies are set up in such a way that any evidence to the contrary can be reinterpreted as evidence confirming the conspiracy theory. So that's the concept of evidential self-insulation. And she says conspiracy theorists have their conspiratorial beliefs in a way that is immune to revision by counter-evidence. Evidence seems to contradict the conspiratorial belief is likely to be seen by the believer as evidence that has been planted as part of a cover-up. No evidence could be presented to them that would cause them to change their minds, because any counter-evidence would be dismissed as a fabrication of the conspirators to steer the public away from the truth. And here's Brian Keeley. I'm just going to give some evidence that indeed this is an idea in the literature. By invoking a conspiracy hypothesis, large amounts of evidence are thrown into question. This is one of the most curious features of these theories. To my knowledge, conspiracy theories are the only theories for which evidence against them is actually construed as evidence in favor of them. Right. The more evidence piled up by the authorities in favor of a given theory, the more the conspiracy theorist points to how badly they, whoever they may be, must want us to believe that official story, the official story. Right? So all over the place you find this idea of epistemic resilience. Now I said there's something wrong with this, right? And it's widely thought that there's something wrong with this. And I think at least one core idea is that belief in these conspiracy theories is diachronically irrational. And here you may think, for instance, of William Clifford's famous essay, The Ethics of Belief, where he talks about the duty to inquire. So sometimes we have a duty to inquire. If we violate that duty, we may well end up ignorant or not knowing or believing something on an insufficiently strong evidential basis, right? So it may be that at a later point in time our evidence matches our belief, but that is because we have shunned certain evidence or not delved into certain kinds of evidence. And as a result, diachronically, so over time, that belief is irrational. So clearly it meets that criterion. But I think it may even hold for synchronic rationality, so rationality at a particular point in time, given your evidence at that time. So clearly when it comes to objective rationality, so your belief is in conflict with the publicly available evidence out there, for instance when it comes to evolutionary theory for a creationist, but also maybe subjective rationality. After all, when you shun evidence, then at a particular moment in time, for instance you don't read any books on evolutionary theory, maybe it matches your evidence, but part of your evidence is that you shun all the evidence to the contrary. So at any particular moment in time, you may realize, upon some reflection, that you believe what you believe, maybe merely because you shun certain evidence. And that fact may make it irrational. So at least synchronically irrational, surely objectively, surely diachronically irrational, objectively synchronically irrational, and perhaps even subjectively synchronically irrational. Sorry for all these conceptual distinctions. That's what we do as epistemologists. Anyway, so epistemic resilience is in trouble, that's the point, when it comes to extreme beliefs. And there are additional reasons to think that extreme beliefs come with epistemic resilience. One other reason is that extreme beliefs are often associated with epistemic vices. If you don't believe that, ask Nora for her scoping review, right? For fundamentalism and fundamentalist belief. Vices, so intellectual character traits, dispositions like narrow-mindedness, dogmatism, wishful thinking, black and white thinking, intellectual arrogance, gullibility, and the like, right? And if you think about these, each of these character traits comes with resilience to evidence, so shunning evidence, reinterpreting evidence, discarding evidence, and the like. And one more reason to think that these extreme beliefs come with epistemic resilience is that many folks nowadays tie it to the notion of an echo chamber or an epistemic bubble. So an epistemic bubble being a bubble where certain information is available, other kinds of information not. An echo chamber also actively disqualifies other sources of knowledge, right? And again, epistemic resilience, right? It makes you resilient to certain kinds of evidence. Did it drop out? What happened? I will continue. Okay, good. So, I need the slide to continue, though. Yeah, sorry. Didn't make it in vain. I want the slide. Yeah, sorry. I said things would get complicated, and we were at that very point where things were getting complicated. All right, so what such epistemic resilience amounts to, though, is highly context sensitive, as this slide shows. So don't worry, I'm going to explain this. So extreme beliefs are often epistemically resilient in the sense that they are acquired and maintained. I'm going to focus on maintenance, despite publicly available evidence to the contrary, because such evidence, this is one option, such evidence is systematically avoided. Don't read books on evolutionary theory, go to creation science museums, for instance. Second, such evidence is systematically neglected even when encountered. So an instance of sexism, for instance, someone suffering from that, don't talk too much to that person, don't think about it that much. Third way, such evidence is systematically disqualified, for instance, by casting epistemic or moral doubt on the source. Right? So Kamala Harris says something or comes up with certain kinds of information, and then people say, well, do you know how many people she slept with, for instance, or she slept with this person to get higher up? Things like that, disqualifying the source. Fourth way, systematically misrepresenting or characterizing evidence. So not merely talk about information or about, for instance, LGBTQ plus communities, but calling it propaganda from the very outset. So you frame it a certain way, misrepresenting it from the very outset. Fifth way, meta-norms and belief policies that reduce the value of such evidence. For instance, you have different standards. If someone from my party gives testimony about something, I believe it, but if it's from the other party, I need at least 4 or 5 testimonies before I start to take it seriously. So different meta standards or meta-norms. And the sixth option is that such evidence is systematically interpreted as supporting the extreme beliefs in question. Like as we saw with the conspiracy theories, right? So Trump says, when you elect me as president, Hillary Clinton is going to jail. He's elected as president, but then she doesn't go to jail, right? So you think, revise your belief, but it's interpreted as, look, the cabal is even more powerful than we thought, right? So the evidence is really interpreted as confirming the belief. All right, so epistemic resilience all over the place in extreme beliefs, and we deem that something problematic. Let's now turn to faith, this other attitude. Yeah, maybe you could just move it. Good. Resilience in faith. So remember, there's religious, secular, and mundane faith. And maybe mundane faith is most important here. So faith in the rule of law, faith in the trias politica, so the separation of powers, faith in humanity, faith in science, faith in reasons. And there we go. I think one reason this whole issue really matters is that, if I'm not mistaken, some people are losing faith in democracy. And here are some examples. So Gashi, with a background in ethics and theology, also does a bit of history. Elizabeth Neumann, from a policy perspective, so she was an advisor on the Trump administration herself. Flag and the Cross by Gorski, among others, and Perry, more of a sociological perspective. So this describes the white Christian nationalist movement or the authoritarian reactionary Christianity movement with sexism, racism, xenophobia, black and white thinking, othering, demonizing the opponent. This narrative in terms of the US was originally a Christian country and the demise, collapse, fall maybe. That sort of story. So this is the movement that they describe and assess. And I think what we see with these people is a loss of faith in democracy and the rule of law. And of course, they would still talk about the value of democracy and freedom. I mean, freedom talk is all over the place. But if you look at what they actually advocate, a lot of them are advocating authoritarianism. Trump taking over, getting rid of current generals, replacing them with MAGA generals, judicial institutions and the like. So dismantling of democracy as we know it. So with them, we see a loss of faith. And when it comes to us ourselves, I think these developments and similar developments maybe in countries like Hungary or India was mentioned, Turkey was mentioned, they may challenge our faith in democracy or elements of democracy. There is evidence now out there that may challenge your faith in democracy. Since things are not going well in various democracies, and sometimes because of democratic processes, right? Some of these leaders have been democratically elected. So I think we need to get a better handle on this attitude of faith and to what extent it is resilient to evidence and how that works. So there are quite a few caricatures of faith out there. So Bertrand Russell, of course, spoke of faith as belief upon insufficient evidence. Yeah, you don't want that. Mark Twain, even worse, he defines faith as believing what you know ain't so. All right. So let's leave those characters for what they are. Fortunately, there's quite a bit of serious philosophical and theological work nowadays. They can be divided into two strands of thought. Some of them say faith comes with belief, so you can have faith in God, for instance, only if you believe that there is a God. Others say, no, faith doesn't require belief, so you can have faith in God even if you're uncertain about the existence of God. But what about this attitude of faith? What is it? And I think this quote is helpful. So by Daniel McCoy and Daniel Howard Snyder, they've extensively written on faith, both religious and secular faith. So they say for you to have faith in someone for something is for you to be disposed to rely on them to come through with respect to it. With resilience, there's the word resilience, in the face of challenges to doing so, because of your positive stand toward their coming through. So it's relying on someone. It's a positive affection. So mere reliance doesn't come with a positive feeling. So a positive feeling with it. And then there is the element of resilience with it. And of course, some of those elements of resilience have to do with non-epistemic considerations. So you're laughed at, for instance, for having that faith. Or it can be practically challenging or culturally challenging. So that is one element of it. But I believe there is also an epistemic component. So a component has to do with resisting evidence to the contrary. And here's one example that illustrates that from Lara Buchak's work. So she speaks of recalcitrance in the face of new evidence when she explores this notion of faith. And then she says, in adopting faith, one is willing to take risks on the proposition without first seeking out more evidence and to continue to do so even if counter-evidence comes in. The downside of such faith is that once adopted, it's more difficult to skew it if the proposition is false. But the upside of such faith is that if the proposition one has faith in is true, then one can successfully complete long-term projects that depend on its truth while withstanding the changing winds of evidence. So her idea is faith is reliance plus a positive feeling, but also resilience to evidence. So you have faith in your partner even if your evidence doesn't strictly entail that your partner is faithful, for instance. And when there's a bit of counter-evidence, you don't give up your faith in your partner, right? It can withstand a bit of evidence. And similarly for democracy, when things are not going well with democracy, or not well with your democracy, or with the rule of law in your country, you don't give up your faith in it, right? So it can withstand some evidence to the contrary. And similarly for faith in humanity. So that is the object of study by Ryan Preston Reuter, and he says at some point, so even on the assumption that having faith in humanity can lead one to make judgments that are to some degree epistemically irrational, right? So it may be the case that at some point in time your total evidence contradicts your attitude. Such faith is centrally important part of moral life. If we hope to adopt a moral ideal that can accommodate both the uncertainty of our moral judgment about people and the moral importance of the aims we ought to pursue in the face of that uncertainty, then we must count faith in humanity among the virtues. So the idea is we must have faith in humanity. It is a virtue, even if at a particular point in time, there's quite a bit of evidence to the contrary. And we may be uncertain about whether it is actually true that we can have faith in humanity. We should stick to it, because if we don't stick to that faith in humanity, there are certain long-term projects that we cannot carry out. Moral project, like being a good neighbor or being a good citizen or contributing to a flourishing democratic society, things like that. So those are some of the ideas about resilience, epistemic resilience in faith. So again, let's try to wrap this up by way of a definition. Faith in some proposition P, so faith that democracy has a future, for instance, or object X, such as the rule of law, is epistemically resilient in the sense that one remains committed to it and continues to believe in it, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, and even at the risk of synchronic irrationality, right? So one can be so at a particular point in time, irrational, for the sake of the overall value that comes with commitment to P or X. So faith in democracy, for instance, or faith in humanity. So this doesn't mean that one sticks to one's faith no matter what, right? There is a certain threshold at which faith becomes irrational, but it can handle a bit of counter-evidence, and more so than mere belief, for instance. That's the idea. All right, so now I've sketched epistemic resilience in extreme beliefs and epistemic resilience in faith. And we can see 4 similarities. Here they are. The first one is, in both cases, one sticks to one's propositional attitude, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Both come at the risk of synchronic irrationality, and that is something we have to live with. In both cases, pragmatic and moral factors, at least as one perceives them, trump epistemic factors, and at least at a particular point in time. And finally, they come with certain further epistemic dispositions. For instance, the unwillingness to seek further evidence. Or maybe you think, maybe I'm happy to seek further evidence, but I will continue to act on it in the meanwhile. I keep committing to a democracy. I will go out and vote, for instance. All right, so what's the difference? You might think, well, isn't there a difference in objects? So you might think, in the line of Aristotle, virtues have a virtuous object, right? And maybe extreme beliefs don't have a virtuous object, and faith as a virtue does. But I don't think that works. So one can have, for instance, when it comes to God, so God is supposedly perfectly good in all regards, right? And yet it could be the case that it is harmful, one's attitude toward the object of God, right? And similarly, one can have extreme beliefs about things that are good, such as fellow human beings. So I don't think it's the object that makes a difference. It's the particular nature of the epistemic resilience. So the resilience to evidence is not the same when it comes to extreme beliefs and when it comes to faith. There are different kinds of epistemic resilience. So here are the differences. First, the scope of resilience. Faith comes with resilience to some evidence, but not to all evidence. There is a certain threshold at which you should give it up. It becomes diachronically irrational if you stick to it. Whereas what we see with extreme beliefs, they stick to it no matter what, right? For instance, because you follow this leader, Trump, for instance, no matter what evidence to the contrary shows up. We see that quite a bit. Not always, by the way. So sometimes people just are tackled by reality itself. They're overwhelmed by the evidence. That can happen. Second, epistemic vices. Faith doesn't come with epistemic vices, or not as such, right? Whereas, according to many extreme beliefs, do come with epistemic vices in many cases. Third, faith comes with avoiding certain kinds of evidence in some kinds of cases, but not intentionally characterizing or misrepresenting evidence. Right? That is not an element of faith. There's also this difference of taking seriously, a notion that Naomi has been working on. Proper faith comes with taking others seriously, not in the sense of agreeing with them, right? And I may find their views abhorrent, but I take them seriously as human beings who know things about their own lives that I may not know, whereas many of these extreme beliefs come with a disposition not to take others seriously. They have a hidden agenda or whatever. Fifth, there's the issue of diachronic irrationality. So faith does not come with diachronic irrationality, at most synchronic irrationality, so at a particular point in time, because one aims to carry out this longer-term project which has moral value and even epistemic value. And finally, I think many extreme beliefs, not all of them, but many of them are static. So they don't change in response to evidence because you're committed, it's part of the ideology, so you stick to them. Whereas proper faith is transformative. It adapts to new circumstances and unexpected, not all of it, not all of it, but quite a bit of it, right? If evidence points in that direction over time, in the long run. All right. Very briefly, so there are, of course, also empirical relations between extreme beliefs and faith, and this makes things a little complicated. So undeniably, a lot of people with extreme beliefs, of course, also have faith in God or in their leader or in the ideology of their movement, right? Fortunately, the other way around, that relation doesn't hold. So many people of faith in humanity, faith in democracy, don't have extreme beliefs. So then an empirical question is, how do the two relate, not conceptually, but empirically in those cases in which the two largely overlap? So how is faith in God or faith in a movement or a leader affected and changed, maybe corrupted by these extreme beliefs and the epistemic resilience of these extreme beliefs? And of course, the other way around, you can also ask, can faith maybe provide resilience towards certain kinds of extreme beliefs. For instance, if you've got faith in humanity, so you believe that the majority of your citizens are to be trusted, they have good intentions, even if they're mistaken about things at certain times. Maybe that can be a source of resilience against things like othering or cosmic dualism. So there's good and evil in reality and nothing in between. No compromise is possible. Against arrogance, right? I think I'm right. Maybe I miss certain things. So I'm happy to enter conversation with you. This sort of attitude. And I think this attitude of faith made us come with epistemic resilience in the sense of it can handle a bit of evidence to the contrary. So if your country has a leader who is clearly at times amoral and at times deeply immoral, who treats women as objects, who acts in the interest of extremist states, who puts the future of your planet in jeopardy, and who makes fun of colored people and disabled people, and that person is democratically elected, can you stick to your faith? Can it handle a bit of evidence to the contrary? And I think proper faith can. So we should equip ourselves with such faith and cultivate such faith. Within certain bounds, of course. All right, it's time to wrap up. I've explored the relations between epistemic resilience in extreme beliefs and in faith. So I think this notion of epistemic resilience is interesting. It is a kind of resilience. The term resilience is used all the time, but it's a little different from the kind of concept of resilience that is often used, and that is fine. So I think it deserves exploration, and in particular, how the two are different and how they relate to one another and sometimes interact with one another. Michelle Grossman has this famous definition where resilience is the ability to resist and challenge the social legitimation of violent extremist propaganda, recruitment, and ideology as a response to social and political grievances based on access to and capacity to navigate and mobilize social cultural resources for coping and thriving under adversity. So social cultural, I think, is surely a crucial notion, but it might be interesting to add the epistemic domain to that. So evidence to the contrary. How do you cope when the evidence, so to say, is in adversity, right? There's adverse evidence. All right, I think there's more work to be done, way more work on this. So I've spoken mostly about faith in democracy, but what about faith in reason, faith in God, or maybe faith in a particular God, or faith in a monotheistic God, or maybe faith in Islam or Sunni Islam? How does that work? Does it have specific resources for resilience? So a lot of more follow-up work to be done, but I think this is quite enough for today. So thank you so much for your attention.